Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give folks another minute or two to fill up the room, and they will begin shortly. Okay, I think we have a nice room full here to start. Everybody, my name is Kelly Vlahos. I am the editorial director of Responsible Statecraft and a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'm proudly opening up this discussion, assessing the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire talks. Will the Europeans sabotage peace with Russia? And obviously a broader assessment of all of the current events and headlines that we're seeing today. This wonderful discussion is being brought to you by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, which is a think tank dedicated to realist foreign policy. And I hope to do them justice because they have been bringing a number of these brilliant conversations to you on a myriad of foreign policy issues and geopolitical importance. And I think you are in for a treat today with our esteemed panel. So we have seen a dizzying number of developments in the last 60 days of the new Trump administration. After 3 years of war, there have been a number of high-level talks, 3 in this week alone, towards ending the conflict and making space for long-term security in the region. Right now on the table is a temporary ceasefire agreement in which both sides are near on ending attacks on energy and infrastructure, and re-engaging the Black Sea grain deal. The US and Russia are engaging in diplomatic conversations at a level not seen in over a decade at least. Europe is looking inward and discussing new ways of increasing their own defense outlays and laying the preliminary frameworks for a post-Ukraine war security architecture. There is so much more to do, but the pace of the advancements on this front toward peace is extraordinary. But what are the downsides? Is the Trump administration willing to give too much away? Is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky too stuck in a mindset, helped along by a stubborn Europe and a Washington establishment committed to maximalist aims and fighting on rather than cede anything to Russia? Is Russia buying its own time, happy to hammer out a new relationship with Trump and the US, hoping that it will come with eased sanctions and other goodies, but not so willing to play ball with Ukraine to end the war? I think the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy has assembled the perfect panel here today with which to air out these critical questions. Because for all the hope that the last few weeks have offered, we have to remain realistic and clear-eyed at the reality before us. In the next 90 minutes, we hope to offer these key perspectives: the barriers to peace in both the Ukrainian and Russian polity, the role Europe is playing and the cracks in their own unity, the Washington establishment and whether it too is ready for peace, and the Trump strategy. Where does it go from here? So I will introduce each of my esteemed panelists, and we will proceed with what I hope will be a quite invigorating conversation. So first we have Artem Moeni, who is the Managing Director of U.S. Operations and Research Director of IPD. He is also a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship in Washington, D.C., as well as an elected member of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University. Nikolai Petro is a senior Washington fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island. He is the author of The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. Nick Gvozdev is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and the director of the National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is also a senior fellow in the Eurasia Program and editor of Orbis. And Gladden Papin. Gladden is president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, Hungary's Foreign Policy Research Institute of State. A political theorist, he was formerly associate professor of politics at the University of Dallas, co-founder of the American Affairs Journal, and he received his PhD from Harvard. So let's start with the questions, and thank you for all being here. Arda, I'd like to start with you. President Trump told Newsmax this morning that the Kremlin might be, quote, dragging its feet, and compared the maneuvering to his own past tactics in real estate negotiations. His comments came after there seemed to be an agreement on the Black Sea grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, but then Russia said it would not accept it unless that its state agricultural bank and other financial institutions involved in the trade of food and fertilizers were reconnected to the SWIFT payment system. The EU has come out since then saying that the withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukraine would be one of the main conditions to lift those SWIFT payment restrictions and other sanctions. Arda, can you talk a little bit about the fine line that the Trump administration is trying to walk in these talks and the moves that it has made so far, trying to rebuild a relationship with Moscow on one hand, while brokering a ceasefire as the first step towards a lasting peace? And what kind of grades do you give this administration for the work so far?
Thank you, Kelly. Let me just add that I'm no longer affiliated with Center for Study of Statesmanship,
Okay.
but let's get into the discussion. I mean, I think the Trump administration, in terms of grading, I think it's too early to tell. However, this has always been about the realities of the war. It is the case that when you win a war or when you lose the war, you end up dictating terms. And I think one refreshing change with the Trump administration is trying to incorporate the realities of the battlefield into the calculation, into the calculus of its diplomacy. And in fact, that is one reason for why the Trump administration is ready to move on diplomacy and forcing the diplomacy. I think there was a moment of honesty when Trump in the Oval Office meeting, told Zelensky that you don't have the cards, and without us, you absolutely don't have the cards. I think that is because, despite a lot of rhetoric, especially in Europe and in the foreign policy establishment, the uniparty talks here, Russia has effectively won this war, and Ukraine has lost this war. And I think it's very easy for us to not see that fact and then try to make policy based on a certain idealism about what is possible for Ukraine and what could be what concessions or compromises could be gotten from Russia. I think it is very clear that the challenge here is whether or not we can actually incentivize Russia to the deal. And that's something that cannot be said out loud, even by the administration. But I think what the positive aspect of the move is that there is a focus, a refocusing on national interest, on why is it that we are there in the first place. I think there's a lot of conversation about how, or as if Donald Trump and the Trump administration is a disrupting force, is upending the consensus, is coming in and turning its back on Ukraine. Whereas the actual question that I think we should be asking is, over the past decades, really since the 90s, what is it that we have been doing across several and successive administrations? And what we have been doing is moving. I think I just lost. Okay. What we have been doing is we have been, doing things in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine that has been against our own national interest. We don't have key vital U.S. national interest tied to it. And that has been the anomaly. And so now we have to figure out what the normal foreign policy moving forward can be that actually sets the United States and its interests for success. And I think one of those main lines is we need to have a broader relationship, understanding, working relationship with Russia. I think the most positive aspect of these talks is that new communication channels have been established between Moscow and Washington. And ultimately, I think the reason Ukraine is important to U.S. policy is not because of Ukraine itself, irrespective of what the Ukrainians told themselves and how it was their choice to trust the Americans when they did so. But I think moving forward, the question for us as the U.S. government is to think as to what it is that we want to get out of the deal with Ukraine, the ceasefire, to actually move us closer to a general broad agreement and a comprehensive agreement between Russia and the United States. And I think that is the key aspect. Bilateral relations between Russia and the United States has to be reestablished on terms that are premised on strategic empathy, understanding the Russian red lines and understanding what it is that we can actually do to incentivize Russia to come to the table. And I think that is tough because we have, as I'm sure a lot of my esteemed panelists will discuss as well, many different voices in the administration itself that have not entirely clear ideas about what they want to ultimately achieve, other than the fact that they all toe the line of the president, ceasefire, and end up fighting in Ukraine. But I think that's a stepping stone to a larger vision, at least by Donald Trump, which looks at the world through a much more power-based and interest-based policy and foreign policy. And that is he respects and understands that you need to give respect to countries that have power. And in this case, Russia does have power and leverage, so we need to work with them. It doesn't mean that America will throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to any negotiation with Russia. It just means that you have to meet them in a respectful manner. And I think that is the best move that Trump has made, and has made his own administration and staff to do the same thing. And I think I will stop there and we can go forward later.
Okay, I have questions for each of you, but in this case, before I move on, I want to go to Nick, because I would like to follow up on Arda's explanation, presentation, with a question that might involve a little pushback to what he said. So one of the complaints, and accepting everything you said, Arda, about having to meet Russia where it is, but where it is, one of the complaints that I've heard bubbling up is that Russia might be taking advantage of Trump's positioning on this, that Putin is primarily using the negotiations to expand the negotiations, I mean, the most recent talks in Riyadh, to expand his war against Ukraine by other means, including dictating future conditions, which might be advantageous to Moscow on the battlefield, maybe draw attention away from military buildup of Russian forces for a possible summer offensive, trying to get more concessions out of Washington, but not really being serious about the negotiations for a settlement, for a long-term settlement. Nick, can you talk a little bit about that? And is that a valid concern within the context of what Arda just said?
Nick P or Nick G?
Oh, Nick G. I'm so sorry. I forgot I had two Nicks on the line here. Nick G.
Although I'd be interested to hear Nick P's thoughts on this as well.
Well, we can throw him in there too.
We can throw him in there as well. I mean, look.
Yes.
Negotiations aren't a morality play. And by the way, let me just start by saying I'm speaking in my own personal capacity on my own time to contribute to this discussion. So none of my affiliations are brought into play here. Look, negotiations are not morality plays. They are about seeking advantage, gaining advantage, not losing advantage. The idea that whether it's Putin or anyone else wouldn't enter into a negotiation process without a sense of how it can benefit him, his position, Russia's position, how it can achieve other objectives. I mean, we have to start from that. I mean, there's almost, Kelly, in the way that you're saying, you're hearing these things bubble up, it's almost as if people in Washington, I mean, I can't believe that they're that naive as to how the world works. Of course, he's going to use the time, just as we would use a ceasefire, just as the Ukrainians would use a ceasefire, as the Europeans would use a ceasefire process to improve their positions, to try to see what they can get. So I think if we take, first of all, this question of ceasefire out of a morality play, and instead say, look, this is about interest. This is about, as Arta opened up with, this is about the hand you have, the cards that you've been dealt with, the chips you have in front of you at this particular moment, and then your assessments, your risk assessments. What do you think is likely to happen? And I think if we keep it in that framing, then we can then move ahead to begin dissecting the processes which are in place. And in fact, it's a very complicated process because it's not a simple two-way negotiation. It's not just simply the United States and Russia. It is, first of all, these are negotiations, and these are indirect negotiations right now between Russia and Ukraine, with the United States essentially scurrying from room to room, actually quite literally in Riyadh, of moving from one place to another. It's a U.S.-Russia negotiation. It is a U.S. negotiation with Europe institutionally through the EU, and with NATO institutionally, and with European governments. It is a negotiation indirectly between Russia and the same set of European players. And everyone is looking for what the advantages are and what they can do to secure their position. Now, obviously, from the Russian perspective, Russia doesn't want to enter into a process that it thinks will disadvantage it, either on the battlefield or for its future negotiations. Ukraine certainly is not interested in a process that would seem to diminish what it is hoping to get out of these talks. And so now the question then really revolves around three process questions. And these are process questions that would be the same questions if this was a Kamala Harris administration at this point in time. And those process questions that have to be addressed, I'll lay them out here and then leave them for Q&A. The first process question is the United States and its European partners have to finally resolve the Bucharest conundrum. 17 years ago, at the Bucharest summit, NATO adopted what I thought was a very ill-advised approach, which was to say that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but with no timeline, no conditions. And what we've been operating on ever since is sort of saying to Russia, nah, we're not really going to act on that. Don't worry about it. And then to Ukraine, but the door is open and we're waiting for you to cross the threshold. A lot of why previous ceasefires, previous negotiations haven't worked out is that we have not resolved the Bucharest conundrum. And we have to resolve it one way or another. There's different ways to resolve it. And as Artem mentioned, even within the Trump administration, I think that there would be a wide variety of opinions on how to do that. But it has to be resolved one way or another. You can't continue with this process of strategic ambiguity. The second, and this is what is now also impacting these talks and these efforts for a ceasefire, and we've seen it from our European partners, is saying, well, anything that the US and Russia agree to, we're not a party to it. Britain, Poland have their own security pact with Ukraine. The European Union has committed that Ukraine will enter in as a member, with whether or not that comes with security guarantees, whether or not that implies that Ukraine has to control all of its juridical territory. And we need to work out those questions. We need to work out who is a party to the deal, what obligations, and countries that say that they're not a party to the deal, what are their expectations if they do things and then they expect, say, US or NATO support. And again, I think that there's a variety of opinions, but that's a question that also has to be answered. But finally, let me come back to a last point on this, which I think is one that we have to really squarely face in the United States. And this is a US domestic question, which is it's very easy for people to sit on the sidelines of any outcome in Ukraine and say why they don't like it, right? And Arta, you alluded to this in the opening. that if your position is, well, we get a ceasefire when all Russian forces have left Ukraine. I mean, you can say that's your position, but if you're not prepared to put the skin in the game to reach that conclusion, including the risks to your own economy and national security, but you use that position as a way to politically forestall any other agreement or settlement, then that becomes a problem. And again, one of the things in the original IPD brief on this, sort of trying to provide advice to the Trump administration and how to move forward, is very clearly this point about mixed messages, that you can't have a situation where different members of the president's team are saying different things depending on where they are. And I think that we've seen an improvement perhaps over the last 48 to 72 hours in message discipline. But that's a real point there. And it gets back, Kelly, to your original question, right? Which is the Russians are hearing and the Ukrainians are hearing different variants of positions and outcomes. And they'll pick and choose to what they think is the best outcome that they want and that strengthens their hand moving forward. So until we see some resolution of these questions, I think we're going to have this process of a lot of talking, agreements supposedly being reached, then complaints that agreements aren't being honored by all parties, Russia, Ukraine, United States, the Europeans, and some of this will have to get cleared up if we're going to be able to move to a longer term settlement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, let's shift over to the European perspective. Gladden, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said last week that Brits would lead a, quote, coalition of the willing that would build the ranks of a peacekeeping force that would include, quote, planes in the air and boots on the ground, end quote, in an effort to negotiate a successful ceasefire in Ukraine. Starmer added, of course, that for any coalition to succeed, Europe must have, quote, strong U.S. backing. And he goes on to say that European allies will go forth to develop a coalition of the willing to defend the deal on Ukraine and to guarantee its peace. The plan has been panned as political theater, with unnamed British officials telling the Telegraph that, quote, Starmer got ahead of himself with talks of boots on the ground before he knew what he was talking about, which is why we hear less about it now and more about jets and vessels, which are easier to do and don't need basing in Ukraine. If he's not stopped, all of Europe is at risk. In a speech on March 4th, French Senator Claude Malhuret described Trump as a, quote, traitor who is capitulating to Putin, aided by Putin collaborators in Europe. He said that we, meaning Europeans, were at war with a dictator. We are now fighting against a dictator supported by a traitor, referring to Trump. So, Gladden, you can vocalize the dissident voice of Hungary. How can the EU play a constructive role in this peace process? And can it, when its leadership is seemingly not playing from the same sheet of music? And Nick G had talked a little bit about unity of messaging. There seems not to be unity in messaging coming from Europe right now. Are there voices in the EU that are pushing for a more realistic approach to what is going on? Are they being heard? Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics at play here from the European perspective?
Well, the European perspective is, I guess, divided into 27 countries, but the Brussels-based EU leaders have come up with a new handy designation to indicate that there's a divergence of opinion between Hungary and the other 26, which is 26 plus 1. And they've now begun to roll out this number. I'm not really sure what it means or implies about the status of the European Union anymore. In my own opinion, the European Union should have one and only one mission at the moment, which is to support the peace mission of President Trump. And therefore, I'm inclined to appeal to a classic cart before the horse analogy to describe some of these attempts, like the ones you just described, which would promise the future delivery of massive amounts of European military support in Ukraine on condition of a condition that doesn't yet exist, on condition that the US will agree to be continue to be the agent behind the new European mission. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say there is this: everyone can agree, actually, that the Europeans should spend more on their own defense. This is something that the President Trump has articulated. Of course, it's pretty obviously the direction of the American approach. Hungary also, at the European Council meeting last week, supported the idea and proposal for increases in European defense spending, just not on the basis of issuing common EU debt. The question then is, what is the mindset? What is the brain? What is the strategy? What is the goal that goes on top of this spending or goes on top of these pledges? That question is, I think, where the issues are. For the last few years, the European Union in general, and many European leaders as well, haven't been trying to formulate their own interests and goals and then design a strategy in accordance with it. But instead, the Biden administration was clearly taking the lead in pushing the Western response. Now there's a new administration in Washington, but none of the EU leaders are, at the Brussels level, none of the EU leaders are changing their strategy. So they weren't really thinking strategically about their decisions in the last few years. No one stopped to say, like, well, should we review the sanctions every year or two in order to see whether they're meeting their stated goals? Like, there's no reevaluation of the strategy happening. So we can really say, which I think that the Hungarian Prime Minister has said a few times as well, that there has been a lack of strategic thinking in Europe. Now, the problem is that when in the current circumstances of the early Trump administration have certainly come as a shock for European leaders, but the instinct that was displayed right after the Trump meeting with Zelensky in those early recent weeks of negotiations, the instinct that was displayed by many European leaders was, we have to make up for the hawkish American stance, which is now gone. And that, I think, is where the question is. We can all agree that there should be more European defense spending. What Prime Minister Orban articulated at the European Council last week was there should not be more European military spending on Ukraine until such a time as there is a new peace agreement or deal reached by Washington. So there's a danger that as Europe is trying to, as they say, find their seat at the table, that could actually backfire if the mindset or the goal that's placed on top of that spending effort is at odds with the current direction of events. So, of course, we will see, but that in brief is how I see the dynamics.
I totally agree with you. We had a piece on responsible statecraft by Alma Rachawansky just last week, talking about this new European militarism. And she said the same thing. It's curiously lacking in strategic thinking and fact-based analysis. Even when Biden administration never expected Ukraine to win the war, European leaders seem to believe in Ukrainian victory to this day. She talks about an influential Brussels think tank, Bruegel, arguing that Russia attack Europe in at least as little as 3 years, simply because the country has X pieces of this and that military hardware. She points out that Italian Prime Minister Meloni had suggested that Ukraine should not be a NATO member, yet still be covered by Article 5, while Finnish President Stubb proposes NATO membership, not now, but triggered the moment Russia attacks Ukraine again after the war ended. So it does seem that this buildup, which Germany just passed or is in the midst of passing a constitutional amendment to raise its debt limit for the first time so that it can spend more on defense. It is to fight Russia. And like you said, is not strategically sound. So it sounds like more like they want to build up a military industrial complex to replace what they see as a vacuum left by the United States, but for reasons that we can't all agree on are realistic, that i.e. that Russia is going to rampage across Europe if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine. Can I ask you, Gladden, you mentioned 26 plus 1. Does that suggest that there's no one but Hungary in the EU that's pushing back on that narrative that I just mentioned? Are there other cracks in EU or Europe writ large that can hold some of this momentum at bay that will eventually help drag Europe to the table with thinking other than proto World War III regarding Russia?
Well, there are a lot of complex dynamics at work, and of course, nothing is more boring than going on a digression about how European institutions work, particularly for an American audience and myself included. But one of the reasons I think that they call it 26 plus 1. It only takes one country to veto a resolution that's put before the European Council, which is the specific body consisting of the 27 heads of state and government for issues that pertain to them. The Brussels bureaucracy over the last number of years has devised a lot of sophisticated ways to get around that body, but it represents the idea of national interest. Like, if you want to view the European Union as something that really consists of a kind of practical working arrangement of 27 distinct countries that have distinct national interests and some shared ones, then that's the body you look at. Well, it only takes one person to veto it. Hungary has the most dogged sense of its own national interest and maybe isn't as constrained as some other countries, even fiscally, having still its own national currency as well. So the dynamics are complicated. Of course, it often happens that in the passageways of Brussels, it's pretty clear that there are other signs of support for the Hungarian position and some exasperation among other European nations. But the problem is that really for the Brussels bureaucracy, I know this has become a watchword, but what we're seeing now is that it's even more resistant to change than the so-called deep state in the United States, in Washington. For a lot of the Brussels leaders, I think they really have nowhere else to go. They feel like it's a no exit, that they're not popularly elected. It is like a permanent body there with very little possibility that a president could simply be elected by the European people and squash it, as thankfully has happened in Washington. The dynamics for really changing Brussels would require a very large shift to the right in the European Parliament, agreement among those parties about a new European commissioner, and that person kind of takes charge and changes things. But you can say that it's fortunate for many politicians in Europe that Viktor Orban exists so that he can stop some things that they would sometimes rather not fight on. But behind the scenes, there's definitely points of agreement. But I would say the main fracture lines are now pretty clear externally. I think what immediately happened in the wake of this American pullback, or I would call it more like a strategic reorientation, a strategic review that is somehow happening in Washington at the moment. You could see immediately there was an assertion of different national interests within Europe, not by every member state, but France had a view, Starmer had a view, Germany is starting to reconsider its long-term fiscal austerity, and there were headlines about, well, should there be a German nuclear weapons program? These kind of questions. Same thing with Poland. So I think we've already seen a kind of fracturing or maybe a reemergence of national voices. It's happened in a haphazard and chaotic way. But if it were given more space to articulate itself, I think it would probably lead to a better conclusion. The main thing is that the argument that the Europeans have been using for several years, just invoking the so-called transatlantic values from the standpoint of liberal internationalism, that's not going to be the glue that holds together the Western alliance anymore. It's not just like a maybe reduced pragmatism only. Even J.D. Vance talked about the shared importance of Christian values. But the point is that it's not going to work to just, shall we say, pressure the United States into actions on the basis of appeal to those liberal international values. So I think it's quite complicated. I know Orban has always stood strong because he has a strong political force behind him. Not every European government is in the same situation, because you have sometimes shaky coalitions, different fiscal situations, which change the calculations of particular European leaders. But I think that the bath of cold water that the Trump administration has been pouring on Europe is having some effects, and probably will lead to a more realistic outcome.
Thank you. I want to move to Nick Petro now. Something that always gets lost in these conversations is public opinion, particularly in the places where conflict is happening. And in October 2022, most Ukrainians, this is after the invasion, most Ukrainians, 60%, already felt that they were part of the national resistance, with another 32% feeling at least partially involved in resisting Russia. Only 4% of respondents did not feel like they were part of this resistance. 84% of those surveyed reported using the Ukrainian language more, 55% more frequently, wore national symbols of support and colors. Support for the armed forces increased, with 81% indicating that they had donated money to the armed forces. 21% joined the military at that point in 2022. Let's fast forward to today. What is the spirit of Ukrainians today? Do they feel that Zelensky is being dragged into these negotiations? Do they feel abandoned by the Americans and the West? Or do they feel that it's time to make the best deal that they can, given battlefield conditions on the ground? Alternatively, by the end of at the end of 2024, multiple Russian public opinion polls showed war support pretty strong still, between 70 and 75%. Do we have any idea what the mood is there for ending the war, and possibly making concessions to the Ukrainians? And in both cases, are people actually free to express their opinion? So I guess my broader question is, how are people in each of these places feeling about their leaders engaging in negotiations that could end the war and could lead to concessions on both sides?
Probably the average citizen feels tired of the conflict, and hopeful, mildly hopeful, that this negotiating process will lead to an end to the bloodshed. On both sides, I think, in Russia and Ukraine. I agree with the general sentiment of those who say it is very difficult to know what to make of surveys during wartime, because there's so many personal factors involved. There's so much fear of how your views might be reported, to whom they might be reported, if they don't fit the mainstream. All of this makes the responses difficult to assess. and to take them, we need to take them all with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, the surveys that we in the West tend to give more credence to in Russia, those by the Levada Center, have shown over the last two series that a consistent support for peace, for a path to peace, about 70% would like to see an end to the war. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're willing to sacrifice anything or any of Russia's objectives. They feel, by and large, while they want a peace, they want that peace to be on Russia's terms because they think Russia's cause is a righteous one. And I would say that sentiment is overall mirrored in Ukraine as well. The consensus on the need for negotiations has flipped since 2022, where very few people were willing to consider the prospect of negotiation. Today, it also hovers somewhere between 60 and 70%. And then the consensus becomes less obvious depending on what issues you ask people that they would be willing to concede. So I think that's where we are in terms of popular opinion. The interesting thing that is now being discussed in Ukrainian social media, I think, is the role of the elections. So we're talking about the next Ukrainian presidential elections, which, as I understand it, as we say in Russian, anybody who is not lazy voices an opinion on. And what's interesting about this discussion about who will run, does Zelensky have a chance in these elections, who would be a worthy competitor, is that it's not limited to popular bloggers. We are now getting members of the Rada, members of political factions in Ukraine. One of the most interesting and well-connected is Dmitry Razumkov, who used to be, I would say, almost Zelensky's right-hand man in the Rada, but is now opposed to him, who says, the key date to watch will be May 9th, because that is the date when Ukraine has to review its regular renewal of martial law, which it is interpreted to prohibit new elections at any level in Ukraine. If martial law is not renewed, and he has bluntly said in public that the Americans are pushing for martial law not to be renewed on May 9th, then of course elections within 6 months are on the table. And that too will affect the outcome of the negotiations. That's not something we mustn't forget. So Trump has interesting cards to play here, and some of that leverage exists within the context of purely Ukrainian politics.
Okay, I've heard about the cards that Russia holds. I've heard now I'm hearing the cards that Trump holds. Does Ukraine hold any cards? Does Zelensky hold any cards? And if so, what are they?
Should I answer first?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, obstinacy, just being obstinate, just saying, no, that's not on the table. We won't discuss this. We won't discuss that unless we are forced to. And if we are forced into negotiations, we will complain about it and we will create a stink. If the Americans force us, we'll complain to the Europeans, and they will create a bigger stink that maybe will influence Trump to reconsider. But beyond that, I'm at a loss to think about what Ukraine's cards might be in getting a better deal in the negotiations. I tend to agree with those who say that the sooner Ukraine engages in serious negotiations, the better the deal is that it is likely to get.
Arda, I would imagine that you agree with that. So I'm going to ask you, is this encouraged Zelensky for so long to keep fighting? So that can you talk a little bit about that circumstance?
I'm sorry, Kelly, I missed your question. I think you were cutting off, at least on my end.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Was I cutting out on everybody's end? Okay, so it's probably an issue with how am I right now? Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So Arda, I was taking what Nikolai had said.
Yeah. Yes.
Sure. I was taking what Nick said about this lack of cards that Ukraine holds today. And I would imagine that you might be of the mind that that this is the fault in part of the West and the Biden administration for encouraging Zelensky to fight for as long as Ukraine has, and in that time has lost a lot of the leverage that it had, that it could have brought to the negotiating table. But we had said, fight to the finish. We'll give you everything you need. Long range missiles go deeper into Russia, and now we're in a place where Nikolai Petro can't even come up with one card that the Ukrainians might have going into these negotiations.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, so I guess the question is, do they how did we get here? And
yeah, how did we get here, and who takes the blame for this?
Right. I mean, I think it's easy to blame. I think it's a collective issue, right? I mean, if we think about this entire, I mean, maybe instead of a person, we can look at this entire transatlantic paradigm and the sort of the mandarins or the officials, the elites that have run it for a long time as the culprit. But it's the fact of the matter is, Ukraine did make a decision. And if I were advising Zelensky or whoever was the president of Ukraine, I would warn sincerely against it, because a smaller country should never sort of accept the promises of a superpower to turn itself into its pawn, to bloody Russia's nose or be involved in a certain sort of confrontation that serves whatever interest the superpower sets for itself. In this case, I think it was highly political, it was ideological, and it was ultimately, even from the sort of transatlantic sense, even rather sort of a worldview and ontological kind of understanding of the world. And it was not necessarily a physical threat, a physical security threat from Russia. As once the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s, we had a very clear understanding from the American side, from all of our Soviet experts who were involved in those early discussions, and from the Russian side, that we would like to be sharing a world to one another. There was a lot of discussion of how to include Russia in the next sort of Western security order. But that all collapsed because we sort of we, as in the elites in the West, who are party and believers in this sort of transatlantic paradigm, they believe that the Soviet Union, even though it has collapsed, Russia can still be used to expand this kind of Western influence, the sort of almost like a global hegemonic position of the Western sphere. And I think it was almost inevitable that this will create backlash in not just Russia, but in and around the world. I think the way that we look at the entire paradigm of how the administrations, not just the Biden administration, but from the Clinton to George W. Bush, then we have Obama administration, but also even the first Trump administration that proudly gave javelins to Ukraine to fight. I think the move toward this escalation was something that was almost intended as U.S. policy for years. And the question I think we need to be asking is as to why. And I think the Europeans also shared this interest because the Europeans have internalized a lot of those American sort of post-war pointers. And they see themselves as the yardstick, the moral yardstick. So America sort of finances these wars, finances these interventions, and Europe and the UK especially kind of provide the moral bromides, the moral justifications. And so they kind of ride not just on the coattails, they kind of see the America, it's almost the way that they describe the pathology. It's they are the ones that hold the real moral trump card, and it's America that does their bidding. This is the perversion and the distortion that I'm talking about. So that this entire paradigm has kind of collapsed because Donald Trump has asked serious questions of it, and because the administration and J.D. Vance are asking questions. Now, the response of the Europeans, I think it's interesting but alarming, right? They seem to think that they have internalized this for so long that now that America wants to take its foot off the gas, it is the Europeans that say, okay, well, we have to now finance our own military and our defense budgets to match to that point so that we can actually fight these wars ourselves. Completely out of touch with the reality of Europe's own position and its inability to carry that burden. So there's one thing to say that the Europeans need to put forward and defend their sort of national interests. It's another thing to say that a sense of geopolitical actorness is to do basically what the liberal administrations or the liberal Atlanticist administrations, successive administrations have been doing for some time. So I do not believe that Ukraine has a way out of this because it has bought into that general sort of paradigm. But I think what we need to understand is this is not just a Trump issue, it's a systemic and structural issue where the United States is acknowledging the reality of spheres of interest and spheres of influence, not just for Russia, but for itself and for the rest of the great and middle powers. And I think that will have some fundamental repercussions around the world and sort of lead the way to a new order. And I think Europe is not comfortable with it. I think Ukraine is not comfortable with it for obvious reasons, but this doesn't have to end in a disaster if, for example, Ukraine accepts that there is no reason for it to not be a neutral country. There have been many European neutral states in the past during the Soviet and Cold War era, such as Finland and Austria, that could be served as a model for what a new Ukraine could be without having a sense of loss and humiliation.
Especially if
Exactly.
that was defined as being in the national interest of Ukraine. I mean, it would have to be a conversion of and a reconceptualization of what is actually Ukraine's national interest, which has been resisted, I think, for ideological reasons and nationalistic reasons in Ukraine.
Let me just, Artai,
Yeah.
you mentioned not only the Cold War paradigm, but there's another paradigm which often gets ignored in Washington and in Brussels, which could be a model and still is potentially a model for Ukraine, and that is Azerbaijan, which has, since 2012, been a member of the non-aligned movement, renounced membership, earlier efforts to seek NATO membership, accepted neutral status. This is not a neutrality that leaves them prostrate before Moscow, because they have a very close defense relationship with Turkey. Interestingly enough, where Turkey assumes, again, coming back to the skin in the game, Turkey assumes certain risks with its relationship with Azerbaijan, which the rest of NATO says we're not involved in if you get into trouble. And this sort of multi-vector approach to accommodate or see where there are Russian interests that Azerbaijan can accommodate. But especially in the last several years, anyone who looks at Azerbaijan and says Azerbaijan is a neutral state is somehow under the thumb of Moscow, that doesn't it doesn't fit reality at all. And that could have been a model for Ukraine, except I think here this idea that Ukraine somehow is European in a way that Azerbaijan perhaps is not, and that NATO Ukraine wanted to be fully integrated into Euro-Atlantic associations. But again, we come back to our complicity, which is we keep holding a door open and saying we want you to cross it. We're not really going to help you cross it. We're not going to take the steps to really bring you in. But we refuse to say it's on us, it's our fault, and generally we find a way to blame the Ukrainians for their inability to do this. One other thing with the cards, I do think it is important that there are actually some cards that Ukraine has. We shouldn't minimize them. I know it's easy when we look at coverage of this war to see winners, losers on the battlefield. First of all, Ukraine still has a pretty reasonable defense establishment. Remember, it was prior to the war, it was the 10th largest exporter of defense articles around the world. You see this in indigenous drone production. You see it in their ability to fabricate and a very innovative sector. By the way, also in Russia as well. Very innovative technology sectors, often driven by these small patriotic companies that work directly with the military. But this is, some of the things that Ukraine has been able to do in the air, on land, and sea in making strikes against Russia should not be discounted. And Ukraine has demonstrated, even in the last several months, that while Ukraine may be losing ground, it can still exact a cost, and that Russia, and this gets back to Nick Petro's points about public opinion inside of Russia, the Kremlin has, in essence, has come up with its price list of what it's willing to expend with regard to the war in Ukraine. And ever since the partial mobilization at the end of 2022, the Kremlin, I think, has decided that repeating that or going to a larger mobilization is a juice that's not worth the squeeze, and doesn't want to do it. And to the extent that Ukraine can continue to slow down Russian military operations, because in a way Russia is not going to unleash its full military potential because of political issues, mobilization issues, and then frankly, Russia has a labor shortage. And the economic team in the Kremlin, who's often ignored, but a very talented economic team, has been warning about that. That we can't sort of harvest Russia's labor seed corn, and that those are limits. And so Ukraine does have cards to play. They may be fewer, but it can exact costs that Russia at present does not want to pay. That may change in the future. It may also change with how aid changes, but Ukraine does have cards, and I think that they're willing to play it. Finally, and one thing with the cards as well, and maybe Glidden can talk about this as well, is the sense that I think the Ukrainians they miscalculated with the Trump administration, to be sure, but that they feel that ultimately most political forces in the West are at least committed to not seeing Ukraine fall, maybe not Ukraine not winning, and that remains a card that Ukraine has, that they believe that fundamentally at the end of the day, the West will not write Ukraine off, and that therefore, going back to Nick's point, I think that fuels some of what we might then term as obstinacy in terms of the negotiations with Russia, because whether that's accurate or not, the Ukrainians believe that they still have a reasonable check from Europe and even from the United States itself, if not from the Trump administration, then at least from a U.S. Congress that has been willing to write those checks in the past.
I'll just say one thing, Kelly, just to sort of piggyback on what Nick said, Gvozdev. I think the view that Ukraine doesn't have, to just clarify, the view that Ukraine doesn't have cards to play seems, I think, to be rational from our point of view. Sitting here, it doesn't have as many cards to play on the battlefield with Russia. But I think there's a big distinction to be made about what we are saying here and how the Ukrainians themselves view their leverage. And I think there is a distance and there is a disconnect between their actual cards and what they believe their cards are. So, for example, when they think about the Europeans and when they think about the domestic political situation in America, the Ukrainians think that they can push those levers to get either backlash to the Trump administration in America, or get the Europeans to double down on their support for Ukraine, because that's the rhetoric from Europe, and also because the EU also has an interest, or European leaders also have an interest in demonizing Russia and excluding it currently. And I think that's why that rhetoric from the Europeans especially is very dangerous and irresponsible, because it gives and sort of reinforces the illusions that some Ukrainians, maybe Zelensky himself, have about what cards it is that they actually play or can play.
Anyone want to follow up on any of that before I move on? Okay. Gladden, I wanted to talk to you about the financial situation that Ukraine is facing. We had a piece by Ian Proud recently, or I think it was today actually. Even if the war ended tomorrow, Ukraine could end up broke by 2026. It talks about the vast financial cost to Ukraine, how its own defense spending has risen tenfold since the 2021 budget was announced. That since 2022, it's run an annual budget deficit of over 22% of GDP, and that based on the current exchange rate, its budget shortfall in 2020 amounts to about $41 billion. But that's assuming that its defense spending will be slightly lower this year, which there's no guarantee of that. It talks about how it's had to raise taxes 100% since the beginning of the war. Who's filling all the gaps? Well, the West and the United States have been paying to keep the government workers' salaries going, keep the lights on, and most recently, a lot of the aid is coming in the form of loans and not handouts. You have Trump out there cutting aid or pausing it, and the outlook for continued aid is not good coming from the United States. So all of this is to say that the war needs to end because Ukraine can't afford it, and it might not have all of the assistance it needs from the West, which is facing its own economic issues. As we know, we don't need to get too far into that, but it really does need to reduce the military spending first and foremost. Can you talk a little bit about the economic pressures, not only that Ukraine is facing, but that Europe might be facing in trying to deal with its own matters in their own households, but also maintaining the assistance that it's given to Ukraine, and what guarantees are there that Europe and the West will be there to help Ukraine get back on its feet, which would take, from what I'm hearing, like over 15 years to get it back on its feet. Can you talk about this all in the context of why there needs to be an end of this war sooner than later, I guess is what I'm asking.
Absolutely. It's a very important question, but I think one additional frame that we can put on it is for America's goals, for Europe and the Western Alliance, and for Trump's goals of peace more generally, what has to happen in Europe? And can Europe do all of the things that it claims that it's going to do? Now, in the last few years, I've gone to a lot of conferences with EU topics on the agenda, and the very first thing I noticed at these conferences are that each topic is discussed as though the full financial force of Europe can be directed at it with no need to reconcile that goal with all of the other goals. So we're going to pursue an industrial strategy and a green strategy and a sanctions strategy all at the same time. And so you start asking, okay, so if you apply the sanctions strategy, will that affect your industrial capacity? Well, that question doesn't get asked, because that would be one of those strategic considerations that comes up. And some departments would have to be closed and people would be sacked because these goals don't cohere with one another. So there's a real lack of coherence of these goals. And this comes up really clearly when we start to talk about the post-war scenarios for Ukraine. This is a very sad situation. It's a very difficult story, but the European Union goal, of which most of its leaders have been pushing for, of continuing to finance the war or military machine in some way, and to bring Ukraine into the European Union, which is something that they're talking about, and to massively increase their own defense spending. All of these things simply can't be done. We ran the numbers at our institute actually and published the results about a week ago. And according to our estimates, any kind of fast-tracked accession to the European Union for Ukraine would cost European Union member states and the European Union itself something like 2.5 trillion euros. That's more than 10 times the 2025 budget for the European Union. Now, why are we talking about Ukraine's EU accession? Does anyone in the US care? Probably not. The reason that it's important is because that number captures everything that has to be done financially going forward. That number includes 1 trillion euro estimate for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Where does that number come from? We took a look at the World Bank statistics. The World Bank is currently estimating that the reconstruction of Ukraine would cost about 500 billion euros. But we looked at a chart and they increased the estimate 15% every year. So factor it out for a few years, and this number, like any construction number, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Let's call it 1 trillion euros. The EU at the moment has been putting about 10 billion euros a year toward Ukraine. That has already been a huge commitment. If the United States pulls back and Europe wants to maintain the defense spending of Ukraine, well, add another 50 billion euros per year on top of that, because Ukraine's defense spending is about 50 billion euros per year. So right now, Ukraine is dependent upon, I think, at least about 5 billion euros per month of direct transfers. These are necessary to finance the state. Like the activities of the state are essentially on overseas life support, just in foreign terms generally, not overseas in the strict sense. But so it's a huge financial commitment. So the question that we should be asking is just a basic strategic one. What are the goals? What are the strategies for pursuing them? And can these goals be reconciled? So let's set Ukraine completely to the side. Let's just talk about German defense spending. German defense spending is great. The Trump administration clearly wants more defense spending. But in order to do that, they'll have to reform their debt brake. And they'll also have to probably reconsider some elements of their social safety net. Can the transition to a higher level of defense spending happen at the same time that political pressure comes because of a transformation or reduction of the social safety net in Germany? These are very big questions. So right now, the headlines are full of explosive claims. Well, we're going to extend the French nuclear umbrella, and Germany is going to spend nearly 1 trillion euros, and Poland will have nuclear weapons, and Ukraine will come into the European Union, and we will participate in a global trade war and suffer the consequences of that. I mean, not all of these things can be done at the same time, and so we're in need of a very elementary stepping back and mapping out of the goals. So unfortunately, this is something that a lot of leaders are not familiar with because of the way that the Western liberal international order has been structured in recent years. But necessity is the mother of invention. So maybe a strategic mindset will be born quickly.
Can I?
Right. And all of a sudden the will appear.
Okay. Well, yeah. Can I jump in and add
Yes.
more pessimism? We have a demographic crisis to which there is no solution. Many estimates say from the high point of 52 million in 1990 Ukrainians, we are somewhere closer to 25 today. All the migrants, or the vast majority of them that have settled over the past 3 years, refugees in Europe, show little sign of coming back. And surveys confirm that they do not look forward to coming back. And it's specifically the younger ones, the more capable ones, which leaves us with a population in Ukraine that is shrinking, smaller, and needs more funding just to survive, and can contribute little, relatively little, to their own well-being and improving it. So it's a doubly difficult situation in that regard. So even money, throwing money at the problem will not resolve that broader demographic tendency. I wanted to get back to the cards that Ukraine has to play, because I think that I want to pull in something that Artis said to something that Nick said and agree with both of them. Ukraine does have cards as long as they survive. They have something to play. But the difficulty, I think, in playing those cards is that the Ukrainian government is at a table where the other players are constantly changing the rules. So even if it has cards, it doesn't know how to deploy them, because it doesn't understand that the strategic objectives of the other players at the table are constantly changing, and they're constantly changing the rules for Ukraine. So it is really hard to strategize in that circumstance. And it's basically the equivalent, therefore, of saying that Ukraine, as the weakest player at the table, doesn't have cards to play.
Kelly,
Nick
has made a very good point, and to springboard from that, which I think is an important development, which perhaps Zelensky's team didn't fully grasp, and that many in Europe did not fully grasp in the transition from the Biden to the Trump administration. And that might have also been due to some of the early appointments and early statements, people like General Kellogg, Congressman Waltz becoming national security advisor. But the Trump administration seems to have very definitively said they don't want Ukraine to be the central organizing principle of U.S.-Russia relations. That not that Ukraine is not a problem, not an issue, but that they don't want that to be the central point. And the Biden administration, after 2022, made a decision that not only was Ukraine the central organizing principle of U.S.-Russia relations, that no other aspects of U.S.-Russia relations could occur unless there was movement on Ukraine. And that the Biden administration, after 2022, increasingly made the Ukraine question central in its in third-party relations, creating strain throughout the global South, where saying, well, you need to be with us on Ukraine, even though you as a country may have very critical relations with Russia in terms of energy, food, fertilizer, technology, and equipment. What the Trump administration has done, and again, this is not a judgment, right or wrong, this is just simply an observable fact, is that the Trump administration has said that there are U.S. equities with a relationship to Russia. And we've seen two come out in the last week or so. One is the Arctic, and the other is the Middle East, where the Trump administration says the road to Moscow from Washington will not run through Kyiv, at least in those two areas, and that in the future, U.S. relations with Russia are not necessarily subject to a veto either from Kyiv or from Brussels. And I think that's just part of Nick's. I was sort of thinking about this as Nick was saying, as the rules are changing. That's a pretty important rule shift that has occurred within the last 2 months. and to which Ukraine is still an issue, but not the central issue. And Ukraine, at least with regards, perhaps certainly with regards to the Middle East, and with regards now apparently with the Arctic. And then beyond that, the relationship, the trilateral, triangular US, China, Russia relationship, the Trump administration is very clearly signaling that Ukraine will not be at the center of those aspects of the US-Russia relationship.
Yeah, if I may just add something to what Nick said by bringing up the Middle East. Two things. First, as we just saw with the leaks of the Waltz to Atlantic journalist, Jeffrey Goldberg, the one thing that was clear is that, Europe wants to do all these things for Ukraine, but it was very clear from the exchanges that Europe cannot do anything, even to the Houthis, that was the one thing that they all agreed on, that the European navies are even subpar compared to the Houthi capability. So let alone Russian, let alone what's going to happen in terms of other theaters. So there's a significant gap in terms of what Europe can do as a player. Now, I think this also suggests a shift as to the mindset of not just the Trump administration, but I think a systemic structural shift that's actually showing the multi-nodal, multi-polar, I don't usually want to use that term, but that's a common term that's used, but a much more diffused power in the system. Because if you look at the way that we thought about the transatlantic relations and relationship post the Soviet era, there was a question as to whether or not and how and what to do with NATO. NATO is an artifact of the Cold War, and yet we have to find a way to keep that entire structure of the old order, of the post-war order, intact. Well, we can do that through Serbia. We can do that especially through Ukraine by turning Russia into an enemy, into a constant threat for the Europeans. I think that mindset of pushing Russia to be our enemy, well, it worked out, really. I mean, Russia took notice, and it did in a way. When you hear everybody in chorus all of a sudden saying that the war in 2022 was unprovoked, that term was used by almost all sort of mainstream sources in the media. There was no reason to insist on that term other than the fact that it actually was provoked. And it was provoked over years and decades for this one reason that had very little to do with strategy, geopolitics, and realpolitik, and a lot to do with idealism, ideology, and politics, frankly, of the European Union and the sort of domestic foreign policy of the United States. I think that has shifted to a world in which we have to acknowledge that there are more regions at play in general, and one kind of enemy, and dividing the world into sort of two blocks, that kind of block thinking, the Manichaean thinking, no longer works. And so what does that look like when you add that element of national interest to these kinds of conversations? What is our national interest in Ukraine? Well, it's practically very little. We can make that argument for many of the nodes of US policy over the past 25 years. So what do we do moving forward is to actually understand what are the superior powers. And this is what, it doesn't sound very politically correct to say, because we like to think of the world as the international system as a world of equals. Yet it is not a world of equals. It is a world of superior countries and a world of middle powers and middle countries and a world of smaller countries. So how do we balance? And what, the first thing to do if you're a strategist is to figure out which part of the pyramid you actually belong on, which part of the ladder you're on, and what kind of options you have accordingly. If you're a smaller country, like Ukraine or Azerbaijan, it makes sense for you to do a multi-vector policy of a positive neutrality and actually protect your interest, your own national interest in that way, instead of turning yourself either into a bandwagon for the closest power next to you, or siding with an external superpower that wants to use you for its own sort of great power games. So that is what a small power would do. But in terms of America and in terms of Donald Trump, this shift towards reality means that we have to understand that we need to meet superior powers like Russia, but even like China, Turkey, Iran. These countries on their own terms in places. It doesn't mean concession, it doesn't mean compromise. It just means that we need to understand that we probably have a lot to work with Russia on to create a modus vivendi for this more regionally divided world that is not geared towards a global, united kind of world situation in which America calls the shot and everybody else falls in line through whether multilateral organizations, the UN or whatnot. So I think the pushback against both that kind of hegemonic order, which basically made the entire world into the sphere of interest of the United States, from the United States itself, as deracinating its population and actually having a lot of fallout strategically and economically for the United States with $36 trillion of debt and whatnot. That shift away from the overstretch and refocusing back at home and understanding the regions again as important means that we don't want to create this kind of world where we divide into the good guys and the bad guys. And I think that is a positive step in itself. And but it's only going to get more and more, I think, ingrained. And I hope that the Europeans, as one player in this game, understand that it is actually in their interest to have a more neutral Europe. So what Nick Gvozdev said about Azerbaijan, in a way, actually accepts on a global scale, applies on a global scale to European countries or big European countries or even the EU. Europeans can actually hedge between America, Russia, China, and others, and actually have a strategic autonomy, not pay lip service to strategic autonomy, but then do exactly what a specific crowd in the United States have wanted them to do.
Well, let me ask the last question here, because we're running out of time, but I feel like each of you could answer it. Maybe, I'll call it a lightning round because we don't have a lot of time left. But you mentioned how Europeans need to get on board with this vision, which is a very realist vision that I think that is shared with your organization, my organization at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and we're working very hard to realize it. But one of the things standing in the way is not just the European unwillingness to see this reality, but also Washington. So like the Washington establishment outside of this group, which I feel like has said some very common sense things about the negotiations and the challenges we face, but the Washington establishment has been very slow to the gate when it comes to these negotiations. I mean, the entire Biden administration had persisted in two things: that Ukraine would talk when it wanted to talk. We've touched upon that a bit, and that until that time, the United States would provide whatever Zelensky needed to win the war. And this was pervasive through the National Security Council, State Department, the military, was supported by a vast majority of Washington think tanks, the whole entire expert class in their writing and commenting on the war. This is like broad consensus thinking about the contours of the conflict, and all of it was repeated through the mainstream media, and I would argue still is. And that alternative thinking on this has been kind of dashed to the margins and is only starting to creep up because Trump is bringing that position from the margins and into the spotlight. So can you guys, to each of you, quickly comment from where you are in this world of foreign policy, national security analysis, whether or not the Washington establishment is ready to push this forward? Because I don't think, given the tumult of the Trump administration and the hyper partisan nature of this issue now, it's not all of Trump's fault either, but like we need the establishment to be behind this if we're really going to move it. Is this going to happen? When will we be able to get the levers of Washington support for real change and real peace in Ukraine? Why don't I start with you, Nick G?
I don't know that it's going to happen anytime soon. A lot depends on whether or not the changes, both from the Trump administration, but from newer members of Congress and newer members, in particular of the Senate, push this forward and are willing not just simply to push it forward, but to create and sustain the voices. And I think that, you know, your point that we're in flux right now, we are, and we were in flux in 1945 and in 1991 as well. So it could turn out that you start to see new approaches becoming acceptable, safe to discuss and to report on, but we're not there yet.
Nikolai Petro, you're in academia. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, from the ivory tower perspective, I would say, you know, I don't think the moralistic streak in U.S. foreign policy is going anywhere. It's been with us since before our inception. But at moments of crisis, I agree that realism reemerges periodically in these bouts. We sort of have bouts of realism amidst our feverish moralism. And this, and that's because the core concept of realism is reality. And reality forces diplomats to the fore and forces the ideologues who would like to transform the world into a better place, whatever the cost, forces them temporarily to recede. But we are, one of the books I have on my shelf here that I glance at occasionally, we are the Redeemer nation. And we, I don't think that's going anywhere, and there's always been this tension between a more ideologically driven political class and a more pragmatically oriented and realist diplomatic service. So the best we can hope for is that there will be a recognition that we are at one of these inflection points right now, and it's time for the diplomats to step up.
Yep. Gladden?
I think that the factors which are driving the reevaluation of American foreign policy now are actually quite deep. And so I think that there's a considerable tailwind behind at least the foreign policy viewpoint that I would be hopeful to see emerge, actually. And it's certainly not going to be an easy process, but I think we can say that the window is open right now. And if certain things are cemented by the Trump administration, I think the window will stay open. The window, if you can call it that, is open because of the strong election victory. And I think it's already been cemented in part by things that, for example, Secretary Rubio said during his confirmation hearings and in his interviews right after that. It's pretty clear that they recognize that the post-Cold War global liberal order is actually a threat or something that had been used as a weapon against the U.S. after a certain point, as I think, Secretary Rubio said during his confirmation hearings. I didn't necessarily expect that the Trump administration would be come out saying, well, you know, we recognize that it's a multipolar world order in which the U.S. now has to compete much more strongly for its interests. Now, these are significant changes of rhetoric across a significant number of politicians and actors within the administration. Of course, the deep state or deep establishment can always strike back at a certain point, but for myself, I'm optimistic that the window is open right now. The factors behind this are deep. We're still living in the like long-term after effects, I think, of the failure of the war on terrorism and or the global war for democratization, whatever you want to call it, and the ideals that went along with that. And the failure of that is deep and widely known. And I think that this trend will continue. So it has to be supplemented in a lot of ways, including with new people coming into the administration or entering those types of positions and career paths in Washington. So it's not automatic, but if the window is open, if people feel that that opportunity is there, then I think good people will join and will have an impact. So I'm hopeful.
That is hopeful. Arda, last word quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything my fellow panelists said on this. I think what we particularly like, the bouts of realism amidst the fervors of moralism. I wrote it down. But, in general, I think what we have is we are in the midst of a great transition, and that's systemic. That's not going to go away. We are also in the midst of a generational shift. That's demographic. That's also not going to go away. And the views of that new generation on foreign policy on many questions, and some of members of the Trump administration are not going to like some of the generational views, for example, on Israel. But when you think about the entire sort of question, we need to understand, there is a shift that's happening within the Trump administration, and the Trump administration, the administration is kind of the standard bearer for that. But then that is about to start percolating and trickling down to the Washington establishment. I don't think this is going to happen overnight. I think it's a long-term change and shift. But I think the moment that both the sort of U.S., what I call the shallow state, the permanent shallow state, some call it the deep state, but that's once the permanent shallow state, as well as the European counterparts, understand that this is not an aberration, that Trump is not an aberration, that they cannot get a new kind of Biden to restore order, and that is the real sort of normal, and that there is actually a new normal, and that new normal is based on national interest and based on pragmatism and peaceful coexistence, and that neutrality is not a bad thing, is not a bad word. When we move towards that, and I think that will happen slowly when the mindset shift, I think we can see a much perhaps, it's not going to come overnight. It's not going to be easy or pretty, but it's going to perhaps be a better, more order that's less ideological and more reflective of the facts. So I think it is, I'm cautiously optimistic in the future, but I'm quite skeptical in the short term, thinking that it will change. However, I think on Ukraine is the starting point. So I think we'll see this shift more than anything else in Ukraine. I think the establishment has very little choice to push back against the Ukraine crisis, because it is all clear as to the chips and the cars, as we discussed. Yeah. So I'll stop there. And thank you, Kelly, again, for such a wonderful...
Yeah, thank you. I've gone over a few minutes, and I appreciate all of you. I mean, this was a great discussion, and I know we're trying to do a lot in the short time that we had. And I appreciate you staying for a few extra moments. Arda, do you want to just kind of say anything about what IPD is doing in the near future, or where people can find, notices for future events and briefs and whatnot?
Yes, thank you, Kelly. So IPD, Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, operates in Canada, but also the United States. And I'm directing the IPD USA section. We have a lot of events and thinkers that are US based. And we advance a realist understanding of foreign policy. We have a lot of events like this one, some in person, a lot on Zoom and virtual sessions. This recording is going to be available on YouTube. On our YouTube channel, Peace Diplomacy, you can find on YouTube. And our website, peacediplomacy.org, has our latest symposium results, white papers, and analysis. So I urge all of you to follow us and put your email on our website. You can also follow the Institute and myself on Twitter, Arta Moini, and Peace Diplomacy on Twitter. So thank you very much, Kelly, again, for a wonderful job.
Wonderful. And thank you all. And thanks to our audience as well. And until next time.
Thank you, Nick, Petro, Gvazdev, and Gladden. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Bye.